honoured custos, honoured opponent, and honoured guests. Today, my dissertation talks about language policy, which is very topical. Sign language recognition is occurring throughout the world, and many deaf communities are campaigning for sign language recognition. And we're seeing many changes in our world. I would like to present two current case studies from two countries who are going through this process of working towards sign language recognition. The photo at the top is from Ireland, and the bottom is from Canada, from the Netherlands. These two countries are two of the few remaining EU countries that do not yet have any sign language recognition. Both countries, however, do have recognition of minority languages in those countries. So in Ireland, they have recognition of Irish, spoken Irish, and in the Netherlands, recognition of a northern dialect that is spoken Frisian. But neither of the sign languages of those countries have yet been recognised. So this is central to my research, is to understand why these sign languages have not yet been recognised. Here's a more current example from Canada. Just last week, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, announced that they will be introducing an Indigenous Languages Act in order to preserve the Indigenous languages of Canada. But interestingly, just a few days before that announcement, there were many other announcements on Facebook and other forms of social media stating that the Canadian government would also be looking to make sign language the third official language of Canada. But that would be through a different kind of legislation, through an accessibility law, which would align with the UN, United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So it's interesting to see the process of recognising Indigenous languages and sign language in Canada would actually follow two similar but different parallel processes. Now, I haven't explored the Canadian situation in my PhD, but I wanted to use that as a current example to contextualise my research. My PhD over the last 5 years has focused on the international perspectives of sign language communities about sign language recognition, and I've chosen two case studies, one from Scotland and one from Finland. And I've been exploring the arguments, the claims, the justifications, the outcomes, and the barriers for deaf communities in achieving sign language recognition in these countries. Now, when we consider the power of language policy, what we mean by that is that language policy is a mechanism of power. Language policy can disenfranchise communities, can oppress communities, and create inequalities. So the actors who create language policy have power and can often impose dominant language policies which overcome the language minority groups' preferences or interests. One author who I have cited frequently throughout my thesis is Johnson, who talks about the fact that language policy and planning needs to have balance. There needs to be a balance between understanding mechanisms for language policy, but understanding community needs, the needs of the people that use those languages. So he calls quite clearly for this balance in any work in language policy and planning. Now, I used an ethnographic approach to language policy, so the ethnography of language policy. And the principles of ethnography explore explore how people create, interpret and appropriate language policies. And when we mean appropriation of language policies, what we mean by that is how language policies are adopted and implemented, how that creates action, how that creates change. So any approach to language policy is multi-layered and is also multi-sited. So language policy and planning is a process. There's not just one outcome that's achievable and is the end of that process. It's an ongoing process. So the central component of my research design was a commitment to linguistic and social justice. So I've drawn upon critical language policy and political theory as two key theoretical frameworks for my research. This photo, you can see on the slide, was taken in Dublin in Ireland last year as part of their campaign for the recognition of Irish Sign Language. And this helps us to focus on my research questions and what led me to developing my research questions. The fact that there's such variation in the types of recognition of sign languages, either constitutionally, through legislation, through other acts which perhaps recognise sign language and other means of communication. There are sign language boards, there are countries that do not have recognition, and there are language councils. There's such variation across many different countries. There's not a uniform approach to sign language recognition. And there are many different words and terms and concepts used. People talk about official recognition, official language, official status. And it's not clear necessarily whether all of these things mean the same with respect to sign language recognition. And interestingly, the international signing communities have used catch-all terms like recognition or access or equality to cover all aspects of what they would like to see achieved with sign language recognition, but there's no uniformity. So the discourses around sign language recognition essentially have a sense of white noise. When you watch the television and you have this snow effect, as you can see on my screen here, that creates a sense of white noise. This is where the community and the government discourses perhaps are different. They're not necessarily speaking the same language or communicating about the same thing. International signing communities have to think about how their campaigns translate into national, local contexts. What national signing communities propose to their local governments. How governments can work together with communities in order to effect the changes needed or to establish the recognition that everybody wants. My observations were also added to through conversations I had in many different countries with deaf people who comment on the fact that when sign language recognition has occurred in their countries, there's been lip service paid to the recognition of sign language, that nothing really has changed. The recognition has not changed the situation for them. And this was a very common commentary that I received, a very common discourse. And so it seems that although signing communities are campaigning for sign language recognition, there is not enough research which provides the evidence needed for their arguments, for their campaigns, to spur on these communities in their motivations to lobby for sign language recognition. So although that we have various forms of recognition through legislation and so on, of course this creates a stronger status for sign languages. we need to scrutinise the legislation that exists on an academic basis in order to strengthen in practice how these legal measures can be implemented. So we can consider how we can sustain sign languages, the vitality of sign languages, and to prevent the challenges of endangerment of sign languages. So when we consider the big picture of language recognition, there is a dynamic relationship between key concepts. Language recognition does not happen in a vacuum. We have to consider societal ideologies, language ideologies, concepts of citizenship, and policy frameworks. So this is the ideological atmosphere which is constantly changing and which surrounds processes of language recognition. So my concern in my PhD was to investigate how these ideologies and how these changing ideologies can impact upon processes of language acquisition, language recognition, and the claims and arguments made by signing communities. One thing I should make clear before I talk about my findings is that I actually published 5 different articles, and these articles form the basis of my PhD, along with a summary of all of these articles and the findings. Each article concentrates on a slightly different aspect of my PhD, so on the international perspective, the Scottish situation, the Finnish situation, sign language vitality. And I wrote all of these articles on my own, apart from the final one, which I collaborated on with Joseph Murray. So today, in my presentation, I'll be focusing more on the content of my summary, rather than the individual articles. And if you're interested in reading further about my dissertation and my findings, then you're welcome to download the thesis from the internet. So when we consider my findings, one thing that's very clear is that sign language recognition is a very complex area. And there are common themes that came up throughout all of my discussions and all my explorations. One particular theme, which we draw on political theory from, is that of group differentiated citizenship. And this means that not all groups are necessarily afforded the same level of citizenship. They're not necessarily given the same rights because they may have their own historical context, their own language, their own culture. And when we consider sign language communities, this concept of group differentiated citizenship would apply to them. Another key thing is that of inclusion. And the fact that some people say that sign language peoples actually resist inclusion. And the reason that they resist inclusion is because they're really resisting assimilation. Instead, they would prefer to have linguistic and cultural self-determination. But instead, what we should consider is the fact that sign language peoples are in support of inclusion as long as they have that linguistic and cultural self-determination. So it's basically inclusion on their own terms. Sign language people would like to have their own level of self-determination and control about their own language and culture. I identified 3 developmental stages in any form of sign language recognition. The first is a symbolic recognition, which focuses on recognition of language in terms of identity, value. So it's a symbolical recognition. The second stage is the instrumental value, where individual linguistic rights are recognised. So, for example, for deaf people, that would be the rights that have access to a sign language interpreter. And the third stage is where educational, linguistic and language acquisition rights are recognised. In my review of the various sign language legislations that now exist, I found that the majority of the pieces of legislation fit with stage 1. So there was a symbolical recognition of the fact that sign languages are real languages. A few would fit with stage 2 and provide individual linguistic rights, but virtually none of them would fit with stage 3, where educational, linguistic and language acquisition rights are acknowledged. So this is important for us to consider in going into the future that is needed in terms of sign language recognition. When we consider comparing sign language peoples with other language minorities, for example the Sami here in Finland or Gaelic speakers in Scotland, there are some comparative experiences. But one key difference is that sign language peoples have dual category membership. So they are considered as members of two different groups, a linguistic minority group as well as a disability group. And that provides the dual category. Now in theory, there should be no problem with deaf people being a part of these dual categories, both considered disabled and part of a linguistic minority. Because we know that most legislation that provides for the needs of deaf signers comes under disability legislation. But I would regard this as deficit framing. And this deficit frame influences the way that sign language recognition occurs in most countries. Because the focus then tends to be on accessibility, so access to sign language or access to information in a sign language. And so when we think about how governments plan for languages, whether it's a spoken or a signed language, we see that the approach that they take is often different in how they apply it to spoken and sign language. So, for example, parliaments may hold working groups and have discussions and committees. And the level of scrutiny that they apply in these discussions differs with sign language planning as it does to spoken language planning. And there are often discussions as to how sign language should be recognised in legislation, whether it should be through some form of disability law or some other form of recognition. And many politicians will make the argument that some kind of legislation is needed because sign language peoples cannot communicate in any other way apart from in sign languages. But one of the things that I would propose is that sign language peoples should also be recognised for engaging in multilingual practices. So what I mean by that is that they don't necessarily just use sign language. They have many other ways of communicating and engaging with the wider community. They may speak, they may write, they may use other sign languages. So we need to recognise this multilingual capacity that sign language peoples have and not assume that they can only function in one sign language. Another key element which would normally occur in a stage 3 form of legislation would be the recognition of deaf children to acquire sign language as their first language. And as yet, we've not seen this level of recognition in any sign language legislation. And this is a very topical issue for us to consider in terms of the political position of governments. Now, in addition to linguistic protection of sign languages, we also need to think about how deaf signers also have cultural protection. Because if deaf children cannot acquire a sign language, how do they then transmit that language to their community and protect that culture of that community. One of the last key issues I found was in relation to sign language vitality. And this actually emerged through the process of my research, because I realised that even if we have established sign language recognition and various legislation, how can these pieces of legislation actually support sign language vitality to ensure that sign languages are not endangered, they continue to be used, and they continue to be sustained? Just having a piece of legislation is not enough. So we need other mechanisms to ensure that sign languages continue to be used. Now, here are the theoretical implications that I believe my thesis speaks to. Of course, there's the framework of language policy and planning. There are many debates in the field of language policy and planning currently, and I believe that my work contributes to that debate and contributes to a new level of thinking about how language minorities feature in the work of language policy and planning. And I've also been able to provide some comparative evidence from signing communities to spoken language work that's existed up until now. In the field of deaf studies, we see a lot of influence from many different disciplines: geography, sociology, anthropology, linguistics, and so on. But deaf studies itself has rarely contributed to other disciplines in a critical fashion. So I believe that my research provides that basis. It contributes to deaf studies itself from a theoretical standpoint, but also has wider implications for other disciplines and other theories. We can also consider a contribution to legal theory in terms of how do people relate to law? How do they relate to legislation? Policymakers and governments use laws to control people. So these frameworks can be established where if people don't abide by certain laws, then they are either oppressed or excluded. So if we consider a framework such as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, then problems can be created if countries do not ascribe by the articles in that convention, for example, in relation to the education of their children. So we need to think about how deaf people abide by laws, how do they relate to laws, and I think this would be an interesting area of ongoing research and exploration. We also have the disciplines of applied and sociolinguistics, and I believe that my thesis contributes to understanding language maintenance, language acquisition, language minority groups, language rights. So I do feel that my work is centrally focused in sociolinguistics. And finally, we have political theory. And only recently have connections been made between language policy and political theory. And even more recently has that connection been made with regards to sign language policy and planning and political theory. So I believe that my theory raises further questions for us to consider in relation to how political theory and language policy and planning make the links. So we need to think, for example, about legitimacy, why it's necessary to have sign language policies and sign language legislation. Who makes the decisions? Who has stakes in that decision making? Who decides what language protection means? So these questions are derived from political theory and can inform future questions for us to examine in signing communities with respect to sign language recognition, policy and planning. And these are central questions that we need to consider in an ongoing research agenda. I hope that my presentation has clarified the summary of my research in relation to the contributions my research has made, the power of language policy. So now I ask you, Honoured Professor, my opponent, as the opponent appointed by the faculty, to present comments on my thesis that you see as justifiable. Thank you.